The Iran deal is dead.
The restarting of the war between the United States and Iran. Trump said that the memorandum of understanding is dead, and we've had two or 3 days of intense U.S. strikes into Iran and big Iranian retaliations into the Gulf countries mostly. So we were talking about this over many videos that the MOU was not going to hold up. He described the MOU as another Minsk type of agreement.
The Minsk agreement was an agreement between Ukraine and Russia that Europe pushed for. It was right after Maidan, the color revolution in Ukraine, where the pro-Russia democratically elected president was overthrown by Western-backed protesters funded by Western NGOs. Then we installed our pro-Western puppet dictator who bans all pro-Russian parties and holds elections, and that's how Ukraine became a Western puppet. Then Russia agreed not to invade Ukraine, and as long as the people in the Donbas region, the southern Ukraine, were given basically autonomy from the Western control of Ukraine. Constitutional reforms in Ukraine to grant special status and self-government to the separatist-held areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukraine never did this, never passed this constitutional reform, and so the separatists were left in legal limbo, just like the Palestinians, and no self-determination and constant shelling from Ukrainian side. Ukraine basically reneged on their side of it.
The Minsk agreement effectively broke down after 8 years. The MOU has broken down after 3 weeks. Trump did say on Air Force One that Iran is calling him and they want to make a deal badly.
Lies.
Of course, the markets went up on this news. Who Trump is speaking with, who knows? But anyway, we're back to this.
At this point, Iran has held the Straits of Hormuz closed for 5 months, basically, nearly 4.5 months. It might as well go the extra 2 more months it would need to make the U.S. run out of oil and to actually get a deal in its favor. Trump will never agree to surrender to Iran unless he's forced to by an actual oil shortage.
This game, it seems, the war goes on. Trump says we have a deal. Trump then says we don't have a deal. Markets go up, markets go down. Oil goes up, oil goes down. Seems like we're back to where we started with all of this. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that's exactly where we are, and I think you summed up the situation exactly correctly. We always said, we've said in program after program that the problem with the MOU is not in the terms of the MOU itself. About that, I think we both agree that, in fact, if you take it objectively, the MOU is actually a good deal for both sides. It's a good deal because it would have enabled...
It's a good deal for both sides. Theoretically, like, it's a good deal for Iran. It's a good deal for the United States. It's a terrible deal for Trump. For Trump, politically, it's suicide to basically agree to implement the MOU as it's written. It's basically him surrendering to Iran. And so he agreed to it because it's something temporary, and he could get the oil flowing out of the Straits of Hormuz, and then he was planning on doing a different final deal, completely different final deal. And Iran agreed to this MOU, expecting the MOU to be implemented. Expected Trump to surrender like he agreed to when he signed the MOU.
The United States to work towards extracting itself from these many complicated problems in the Middle East, which are not in its true interest to be involved in. And of course, it would be a deal for Iran because it's a pathway towards peace for Iran. But the reality was that the United States was never going to fulfill the terms of the MOU, except in that one respect which benefits the United States, which is securing the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. So what the Iranians discovered was that they'd loosened their grip on the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping was passing through the Strait of Hormuz, maybe not in the vast quantities that we saw before the 28th of February. Maybe most of it was going to China and India. But the very fact that shipping was passing through the Strait of Hormuz was taking some of the pressure off oil prices and was enabling the US to slow down its drawdown on its own strategic reserves. And as a result, the Iranians were losing leverage over the Americans, who were not complying with any other part of the terms. So 2 days ago, the Iranians said enough. They started to conduct attacks again on tankers that were trying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
One of the tankers that they attacked was a Saudi tanker. It became increasingly clear that the Iranians were going to tighten their grip on the Strait of Hormuz. Again, Trump, who has been always...
To be clear, Iran wasn't preventing ships from going through. It's that there's two routes through the Strait of Hormuz. Well, there was. One was the Iranian route that goes through here and basically like this. And then there was one, the southern Oman route that passed just along the tip and went like this. Now, the United States was encouraging ships to go through the southern route without talking to Iran. Basically, as if it was the Strait of Hormuz didn't belong to Iran. That was the problem. That's why Iran attacked these 5 ships. Ships could go through this part. Well, maybe not now after the U.S. strikes, but as of 3 days ago, ships could go through this, any ship, through the Iran-sanctioned part, as long as they talked to Iran before and submitted the application and went through the official process. But America hated this because it knew that getting ships used to going through Iran's route and registering with Iran was just setting the stage for Iran to charge tolls eventually. It was giving Iran control of the straits. And so that's why it was telling ships, don't do that. Go through the southern route. And Iran said, no, we control the straits, and attacked.
Under pressure ever since he signed the MOU from the hardliners in Washington, from Netanyahu in Israel, from some of the hardliners in Britain, who've been very active. That is, by the way, a little discussed story. And the result was that he took the decision to restart the war, in effect, and that is where we are. So we are now back, in effect, to where we were before the ceasefire was announced on the first week of April. We see strikes and counterstrikes. The latest American strikes on Iran were on a big scale. They were much bigger than anything we've seen since the first week of April. And the Iranians are reciprocating. And no doubt there will be lots of diplomatic efforts by all sorts of parties, the Saudis, the Pakistanis, the Chinese, to get this thing.
I'm sure, yes. Indians too. Everyone who gets oil through the straits, and all the Gulf states that want to sell their oil. But Iran wants to win the war.
Together again. I doubt actually that Trump is talking to anybody in Iran at the moment. He said this so many times, you remember, during the war, that he was involved in all kinds of negotiations and discussions and meetings, and that the Iranians wanted a deal and that they were about to agree to a deal. And it never quite happened until he signed an MOU, which was basically a shopping list of Iranian demands. I don't think there are any substantive contacts between the Iranians and the Americans at the moment. Perhaps some kind of diplomatic process will restart. The trouble is that trust was already poor.
I don't think so. I think at this point, like Trump said, the MOU is dead. These extensive strikes by Trump, I don't think Iran's going back to just opening the Strait of Hormuz and giving away all its leverage and getting nothing back in return.
Before the MOU was signed, and trust has now come to pieces completely since the MOU was signed, with the Iranians seeing for themselves that the warnings they were getting, and some of the warnings that were made within Iran itself, that a paper, a document, a treaty signed with the United States, at least with Donald Trump, is not worth the paper it is written on, that those warnings were true.
It's sad that that is true.
So 200 million barrels. They got through the Strait of Hormuz over the past 3 weeks of the MOU ceasefire. According to oil experts Alexander, that is about 2 days of global demand. 60 million barrels of that 200 million was Iranian, which was sanctioned. Trump lifted the sanctions. Trump has now put the sanctions back on. They've snapped back on Iranian oil. But of the 200 million barrels, 60 million were Iranian. And you have to imagine that oil most likely went to China.
Yes.
So in 3 weeks, we got 2 days of global demand of oil was shipped out of Hormuz.
Here's the graph. We got this little spike right here, thanks to the MOU. And now this is way down again. And this is where it should be.
Yes.
So the situation, what you just mentioned with the strategic petroleum reserves and the shortages from the 60-day war, none of that was really relieved or resolved during the 3 weeks of the MOU.
No, none.
Or a little bit, a very, very small amount.
Very little bit. But if it had continued through the summer and the autumn, the way I think that the Trump administration, or at least some people in the Trump administration, were hoping and expecting that it would, well, it would have made the difference. And of course, the other thing that it did, and for Trump himself and for the Republicans it is important, is it lowered the price, the headline price of oil and the price of gasoline at the gas stations in the United States in the run-up to the midterms. So it may not have moved the dial, radically in terms of the whole energy situation, but if it had continued through the summer and through the autumn, it would have been bad for the Iranians. The other thing, of course, was that during the period of the ceasefire, the United States was able to staunch its expenditure of precision-guided weapons, which it is having massive problems replacing. Now that has resumed all over again. So we're going to get more depletion of inventories the longer the war goes on.
Yeah.
The Iranians...
U.S. was already critically short of a lot of precision ammunition. And like you said, it's not going to help. And about this being bad for Iran, if this had continued, then the point at which the United States ran out of oil would have been pushed back another 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe it's right as of right now. I think very end of July, beginning of August is when the actual shortage will hit, and that's what I'm waiting for. That's finally going to be the exciting part. Apart from the beginning of the war where the missiles were flying, the oil shortage and the squirming in Washington because as Trump sees his midterms chances collapse and is forced to surrender to Iran, it's going to be something to see.
As we've discussed in many programs, the pressure on the Iranians from all sorts of external parties, first and foremost China, to agree to the opening up of the Strait of Hormuz. India too. When Pezeshkian last spoke to Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, Modi insisted that the Strait of Hormuz must be reopened. So the Iranians have been under significant pressure, but they saw what was happening.
I will say, on tangentially related, I think this is going to have a drastic impact on the Republican Party and the manga base after this Iran war, because they're going to see this is going to kill Republicans in the midterms, and they're going to be furious. Like a lot of people right now still think, just Democrats are so insane. Of course, they're going to lose midterms because common sense people will be against it. But then you have Trump completely wreck the global economy and make oil skyrocket, have oil shortages that completely disrupt life, and hand Democrats midterm. They're going to be like, you sacrificed everything domestically, immigration, gender issues, all the insanity Democrats are doing. You've harmed Republicans on all of this just for this stupid Iran war that no one in the United States, no one in manga wanted. It's after this, I think there will be zero appetite for any foreign interventions of any kind from the Republican side after they get fucked over by this Iran war. And I think public opinion against Israel will turn twice as hard because anyone who supports Trump's domestic agenda is going to be furious at Israel for screwing Republicans over.
The United States was doing, they could see that they were being strung along. And that made them very alarmed. And I think something else probably changed the mood in Tehran. And that is the funeral of Khamenei, the former supreme leader, the man who was assassinated. Because what we saw was an enormous turnout of millions, probably tens of millions of people, to Khamenei's
It reminded the Iranians of all they'd lost and all Trump and U.S. took from them. And it has them in no mood to compromise.
Funeral. And I think that gave the Iranian government and political system an extra boost to its confidence. It told them that the population is still supporting the political system in Iran, that it still commands.
25 million is what I hear, the numbers for Khamenei's funeral.
Mass support, that it's prepared to absorb the blows that the United States is inflicting, that there is in other words, a reserve of political capital that has not been depleted in Iran, and that worries, fears of internal destabilization have been overemphasized. This has always been, for Iran, the major weakness. How internally stable is Iran? Well, we saw that they got through the 40-day war successfully. We've now seen, as I said, this enormous turnout of people. And that possibly has given the Iranian government a sense that they can keep going for many more months without an internal crisis, and that they can also...
And I'm sure that's true, especially if the United States is bombing them, because that hardens the population against the outside enemy.
So, stand up more firmly to their friends and allies, China, Pakistan, India, who have been asking them to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
So where do we go from here? Will there be a block of the Strait of Hormuz? Will we get back to the MOU, only to have it broken again? Will the Trump administration impose a sea blockade? Will they reimpose a sea blockade?
Right. As to the last,
I think that no ships going through the southern route will be tolerated anymore. As to the southern route, it looks like this, the Oman route. This is going to be shut out for good. Right here, there's mines, and so this will be the only way ships go through. Whether Iran will start charging a fee again, I think they might if the MOU is collapsed. We'll see.
if things continue as they are, in other words, with each side launching strikes against the other, and with the Strait of Hormuz closed, because it is closed. By the way, I just checked before we started doing these programs, the Iranian media, and they are saying that the Strait of Hormuz is closed. So if this continues, then I think the United States will move to re-establishing the sea blockade. There are some US warships in the region, nowhere near as many as we saw back in March, but no doubt the United States will try to redeploy them. That will cause enormous stresses within the US military system. And it will...
Yeah, Trump has a view of the military that's like the average American, like Asmongold, in that it's all powerful, it can do anything. And so despite the fact that it is much weaker than it used to be. And during the first Iraq War, we had 5 aircraft carriers around Iraq. This time, during the Iran War, 3 at maximum. And most of the time it was 2. We just don't have the same military capacity as we used to. We couldn't raise 300,000 troops that we did during the Iraq War today. It would take us a year and we'd have to do a draft. It wouldn't be pretty.
Will upset many of the sailors and their families. But anyway, we will no doubt start to see that happen. But eventually, I've no doubt the United States will move back to reimposing the sea blockade. I think that is a given. The only question is whether the diplomatic pressure is going to be enough, and there's going to be a lot of diplomatic pressure, is going to be enough to get the Iranians to change their stance and to go back, in effect, to the MOU, demanding more guarantees from the Americans, which are...
Again, the problem with the MOU is not what U.S. agreed to or what the language of the agreement. It's the fact that the United States doesn't honor any of its part of the agreement. Israel was supposed to get out of Lebanon. That hasn't happened. U.S. was supposed to unfreeze assets. That didn't happen. Sanctions were supposed to be listed. That didn't happen. Only part that Trump did was lift the blockade, his porous blockade of Iranian oil. And now he's probably going to reverse that.
Of course, the Americans might agree to, but which won't act on. So here, again, I think that there is the split within Iran itself. There's people like Pezeshkian and Ghalibaf who are committed to this diplomatic process with the United States. There's various lobby groups within Iran, people connected maybe to the bazaar in Tehran. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm perhaps wrong about attributing opinions to particular groups within Iran.
There are people in Iran that want to make a deal, but there are also people in Iran that are furious at the MOU and those who negotiated it, and calling current president like a traitor for having given in to this deal that the United States isn't honoring and throwing away Iran's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz.
Iranian society, I don't have that granular knowledge of the political and societal system in Iran to be able to speak with confidence. But there are undoubtedly many people in Iran who still favor some kind of understanding and rapprochement with the US, and who are prepared to make significant concessions to achieve it. And that group remains strong.
They are so stupid. right now, Iran is just a country to be taken out and balkanized as far as the United States is concerned. Just look at what happened with Syria, which overrun by ISIS, 1 million Christians genocided, and a country now ruled by a former Al-Qaeda terrorist. Yeah, that's what U.S. and Israel want for Iran. And yet they promise, because this is a promise of mainstream media that's so powerful, the United States is good, benevolent force in the world, and that makes people that believe in that type of propaganda in Iran think, oh, we could just do a deal with the United States, despite everyone who's made such a deal getting completely screwed over.
Now, the question is, will they prevail, or will the more hardline groups in the IRGC, in the clerical leadership, will they prevail instead? I think that, as I said, Khamenei's funeral has greatly strengthened the second group as against the first. But we'll just have to see. It is always the way this war, the way this conflict develops has always depended first and foremost on internal developments within Iran. I think now the kind of political crisis that we thought might happen back in February, millions of people on the streets, the government collapsing, regime change, that now looks extremely unlikely, at least for the next few months, year perhaps. But splits within the government, the political system, that's another matter.
Well, if you take into account what you said with Iran, the domestic issues being resolved because of the large turnout for the funeral, that means that the conflict, how it ends, how it develops and how it ends, will depend on the strategic petroleum reserves. How much?
Exactly. And that's what Iran should just focus on, because it's the only thing that matters. Once the United States runs dry and shortages begin, that's when the real pressure on Trump will start. That's where Iran will be at the point of maximum leverage over the United States and will actually maybe get an agreement that the U.S. will live up to. U.S. might actually force Netanyahu out of Lebanon in order to get the Straits of Hormuz open. If I was Iran, actually, that would be my strategy right now, is say, okay, sure, we'll discuss things again. Just get Israel out of Lebanon, and we'll reopen the Straits and we'll abide by the MOU. Just fulfill that portion of the MOU, getting Israel out of Lebanon, and we will live up to our side. And I'd ask that because I know that Trump would never do that. Not right now. Not until the oil shortage hits. So it would be perfect demand to just stall for time until the United States runs out of oil.
How much does the United States have? Because if it starts to 4 weeks, 5 weeks, if it starts to run low, if Iran takes this to a conclusion, to the conclusion where they say, you know what, Hormuz is going to stay closed until you guys run out of oil. It's that simple. That's how we're going to do this.
And again, they've held this straits closed for 4.5 months. It makes no sense to give up now and just before you get to the actual shortage. I said at the beginning of war, 6 months, Strait of Hormuz closed. Iran wins. They've done 4.5 months. Why stop now at the edge of victory?
The United States will have to hit Iran as hard as they possibly can if they're starting to enter a scenario where they have 1 week left or 2 weeks left of SPR. Or they're going to have to, I don't know, they go back to the...
They can't hit Iran any harder than they already have. So what Trump's doing right now, the strikes, that's not going to change anything. Iran controls the straits. And so, yeah, Trump might hit them harder, but that'll just make them tougher in negotiations.
MOU, but the MOU wasn't working. So you negotiate a new deal, but how do you get both sides to comply to that deal? How do you get the Trump administration to comply to that deal? So it just seems to me that the natural progression of this, unfortunately, is going to be Iran saying Hormuz is closed until you guys really feel economic pain, and the U.S. saying, you know what, we're going to hit you as hard as we possibly can to avoid that economic pain or to prevent that economic pain.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. No.
I actually think that it's very possible that there is no final agreement, that Trump and Iran don't negotiate. But there doesn't need to be a negotiated settlement. All needs to happen, like the United States withdrawing from the region, which Iran wants, and Trump doesn't blockade. Trump allows Iran to control the Strait of Hormuz and do a toll. He doesn't object to that, and that becomes established. And he gets Netanyahu out of Lebanon, and then that becomes new status quo without a formal agreement. He needs to lift sanctions so ships can go through and pay the toll. That's a real problem with the toll on the Strait of Hormuz, because it's not just a matter of Iran's going to get this much more income. It's just all these countries and all these shipping companies, if they pay the toll, they're worried that they're going to be hit by sanctions, and so they can't pay the toll, and that's why the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is frozen, despite Iran letting ships through that would pay toll, is because this is the sanctions, the impact of the sanctions preventing ships from moving through. It would be all the way back up here if they weren't afraid of that and the war. So if the United States lifts the sanctions and gives Iran control of the Strait of Hormuz, traffic will start returning to pre-war levels. And that's why, if I'm Iran, I absolutely want to charge a toll on the Strait of Hormuz, is because it forces U.S. to lift sanctions, or at least to the extent that they pay the toll.
And I think that is more than likely the way this is going to go. As I said, I do think, let's call them the hardliners, or if you like, the realists. I mean, because ultimately, I think they're the more realistic faction, in the sense that they're the faction that recognizes within Iran that any paper signed with the United States is worthless, in the sense that the United States will never see through the concessions that it makes. I think they have been greatly strengthened by the events of the last 3 weeks. The fact that the United States did not comply with the key provisions of the MOU, and the fact that, as I said, all these millions of people turned out for Khamenei's funeral, suggests that the sentiment within Iranian society is backing them. So I think they've been greatly strengthened. And I think they're making exactly the argument that you made, that it's foolish to agree anything with the Americans. What you need to do is to hold out until the reserves in the US are drained. And then at that point, the US will be in such a weak position that you insist that their forces are removed completely from the Persian.
Yes, and it's what I've been saying for months. Once the oil shortage hits, that's when this is going to finally be resolved. And Trump will finally surrender to Iran. Trump in no way will Trump surrender to Iran before he's forced to. And so we need that oil shortage.
Gulf, and that they recognize full Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz and act on that as a condition for the Iranians eventually opening the Strait of Hormuz. That's probably the plan that, as I said, the Iranian hardliners are advocating. But that would not just be a defeat for the United States. That would be a total defeat for the United States.
But that's what the United States is heading to. That's why I thought this Iran war was the most stupid mistake by U.S. president, at least within my lifetime, and probably in the 50 years before that. You don't start a war that you're guaranteed to lose catastrophically.
That is not something that Donald Trump would accept.
He's not going to accept willingly. You need to add the willingly. He's going to accept it, but
something that a lot of people within the political system in the United States would accept. So I think that we are very likely again back to drifting towards an all-out.
Well, you see, as of right now, not many Republicans would accept it. In 2 months, when their chances in the midterms are going down the drain, they might accept it then.
War between Iran and the United States, in which case, sooner or later, somehow or other, in some form, there is going to be deployment of ground troops. And I was looking at various posts that various people in the US.
That is one thing that might be possible, that right before the United States runs out of oil, they try something suicidal on the ground. It won't work. A lot of Americans will die. The United States will withdraw in shame, and then they'll get hit by the oil shortage. And this Iran situation is a complete disaster for Trump. He was screwed the moment he killed the supreme leader of Iran. There was no way out for him. He's been just squirming on his way to hell ever since.
US are publishing, and I saw Mark Levin, for example, and it seemed to me that he is definitely pushing in the direction of the US deploying ground troops and starting some kind of ground operation against Iran. He would argue, no doubt, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz rather than to reoccupy or occupy the whole country. But it's increasingly looking as if that's the direction that some people in the United States say they should go. Of course, if that does happen, if we start having ground operations on top of what would by then be.
What will happen is you're going to have dozens, if not hundreds of videos of FPV drones diving into U.S. Marines. And the last expression of a shock on the Marine's face before it hits. Just like we've had with Ukrainian and Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And that's going to hurt Trump politically. Ooh, is that going to hurt Trump politically?
An already existing crisis in the Western economies, a situation where reserves are down to 1 week, almost inevitably involves things like rationing, for example, something that we have not.
The rationing is going to be interesting because, from what I understand, gasoline won't be the biggest problem. The problem is jet fuel and diesel. They're made from the same type of crude, and it's the crude we get from the Gulf. And that's what's going to be short. So U.S. will have to make a choice. Do we make diesel for the trucks or jet fuel for the planes? And I think it's going to go more on the diesel side since trucking is important. But some critical stuff is also flown. It's going to be a complete mess. And I think gas prices will head up, but not to the extent of diesel prices.
Seen in the West since basically the 1973 crisis. Well, then, I mean, it's difficult to try to calculate what the political effects in the West of that would be.
Do we get back to the MOU? Is there any chance that we get back to it?
Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, there
After
absolutely is.
everything that's happened?
There is. I mean, as I said,
There's always a chance. We've been tethering at the edge of an agreement for months now. But this time I think it's less likely, though.
China, India, Pakistan, the Persian Gulf state.
Because of Khamenei's funeral and the hardening of Iran's stance.
It's all sorts of people around the world are going to be pressing very hard to get back to the MOU. The hardliners in Iran are now saying this is completely wrong. They appear to be.
They only need to withstand that pressure from the rest of the world for a month, 2 months maybe, to get their victory over Trump. So I think they can do that.
Backed by the new supreme leader, Moshtaba Khamenei. When the MOU was signed off, he came out and said that he, in principle, really didn't agree with it, but that he went along with it because he felt that there was no choice. The reason there was no choice was because at that time the diplomatic pressure seemed to be too strong, and I think he probably worried that if he held out, there would be splits within the political system.
But now the MOU that the United States failed to live up to, Iran can point to that as the reason they're not agreeing to something new with the United States. Like, we gave it a chance. We did the MOU. We signed it. We lived up to our part. But the United States failed to deliver on any of its promises. So we can't do that again.
And he didn't want those splits at that time. I think, as the hardliners are in a much stronger position this time. But the others have not gone away. They are still there. And they will be arguing that ultimately it is not in Iran's interests to get involved, drawn into a long-term confrontation with the US, that Iran...
They are completely wrong about that. If Iran capitulates and opens the Strait of Hormuz now instead of holding it closed 2 more months, then 6 months from now, after the midterms, Iran gets bombed again. And those same moderate leaders that are maybe pushing for this are the first ones that will be killed. They're idiots. Pure, unadulterated idiots. If they want to open the Strait of Hormuz now. No. Iran is on the verge of establishing true deterrence, causing an actual oil shortage around the world that hurts the world so much that if Trump even thinks about attacking Iran again, the rest of the world leaders would go over and slap him in the head, say, stop that, you're crazy. And he won't be able to ever attack Iran again. Just hold the Strait of Hormuz closed 2 more months. That's all it takes to establish a deterrence that'll last decades.
Would take enormous damage, that the Iranian people would suffer massively, all of which is true, by the way, and that the better way forward is to do some kind of...
You say airline bailout, but that's impossible. The United States can provide cash, but it can't provide jet fuel out of nothing. So you can't provide jet fuel it doesn't have. It might bail them out. Okay, it might do all diesel production and not do jet fuel and bail out airlines from all the lost revenue from the canceled flights. It might do that, yes. But it can't give them the jet fuel they need to survive.
Deal and see whether things can be moved forward and go back in effect to the MOU with perhaps a few extra conditions thrown in.
And honestly, that bailout, I think, would be justified because the airlines face a jet fuel shortage. It's entirely Trump's fault. So it is the government's fault. And so the government should bail them out.
So that argument is going to happen in Iran. It's going to play out. Iran does not have what it did have before the 28th of February, which is one individual, the former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who had undisputed authority over all the factions and could make the final decision. Ali Khamenei said that there should, in the event of a conflict with the United States, there should be no temporary ceasefire. He essentially agreed with the hardliners, but he is gone. And we can't, and his son, who has replaced him, clearly does not have his father's authority and is said to be wounded still and was not able to attend his father's funeral, which again perhaps highlights the fact that he's not in such a strong position.
All right, we will end the video there at the Duran.locals.com.
That was a great video. Now, I wanted to have a quick look at the Wire's daily summary for today.
2026. This is The Wire for 2300 Zulu, July 9th, 2026. Precedence is routine. Information cutoff is 2200. Bottom line up front. War continues in Middle East as ceasefire remains defunct for now. Merchant traffic in Hormuz slows to a crawl due to targeting. Beginning with international events in the Middle East, the
Nothing's getting through the Strait of Hormuz, except Iranian tankers right now.
war continued to escalate overnight, with many targeting efforts being undertaken by the United States and Iran. Within Iran, the United States continued to strike coastal sites and fast boat ports, in addition to striking more substantial infrastructure targets deep within Iran. These strikes...
That's why I think a ground operation might be likely, is this type of targeting. This is all about the control over the Strait of Hormuz. And just hitting these coastal installations alone won't be enough to break Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz. There needs to be a ground component to that. So I think this is prepping the way for doing some type of operation on the ground.
Strikes continued throughout the day, with explosions being reported throughout the country this afternoon. On the Iranian side, many strikes were carried out on the usual sites throughout the region. In Kuwait, Ali al-Salam Air Base and Camp Arifjan were targeted, with the Iranians claiming to hit a Patriot battery at one of these sites. In Qatar, a radar installation was targeted and a fuel depot was targeted in Bahrain. In Jordan, Mufawak al-Salti Air Base was targeted again, with the American embassy in Amman urging all Americans to shelter in place during the strikes. Drone and missile strikes were also reported targeting U.S. positions in Erbil, Iraq, the success of which is currently unknown. On the home front, in New York, the Department of Buildings has reported that the former Pfizer building has largely been stabilized after severe buckling and a partial collapse of the upper floors was observed a few days ago. Various
Yeah, I remember hearing about that briefly. That is... wear and tear applies even to skyscrapers. But it's another example. Even in this case, it didn't collapse. Unlike World Trade Center 7.
Enforcement operations continue to be undertaken to further stabilize the structure, and a third-party construction firm has been brought in to conduct additional repairs. Analyst comments for this wire. Despite many airframes being transferred back to the United States from the Middle East, American targeting within Iran has continued throughout the day. The heavy reliance on Tomahawk munitions, as observed on the ground by Iranians, also adds weight to the theory of the U.S. having to rely on standoff munitions due to the logistical movements resulting in fewer aircraft being available for bombing runs. Also, last night...
Yep. So, jet fighters have a limited range. To strike deep into Iran, they need refueling tankers to refuel them on the way and then on the way back. And there's a limited amount of refueling tankers in the region available, and they've been forced farther back to safer bases because the bases right next to Iran are easy to be hit by drones and not safe to keep tankers. And if they're using Tomahawk missiles, that's something you can send it from further away. It's standoff missiles. that travel on their own from where they're fired, sometimes hundreds of miles, to hit their targets. Those are much more limited in quantity. They need fuel, they need good tracking, etc. Gravity bombs that fighter jets just drop straight down, they usually have bigger explosives, and we have nearly unlimited quantity of those. Problem: the fighter jet needs to be basically right above the target to drop them. If you're right above the target, you're in range of Iran's air defenses, which have undoubtedly been strengthened since the war started.
That strikes were also possibly more significant than meets the eye. Locals on the ground reported the Aktaka-Khan railway bridge being struck overnight, which was interesting due to its location being in the far northeastern corner of Iran. This bridge is part of the newly unveiled China-Iran Railway Network, which is a series of rail lines linking Iran to western China. These
This will annoy China.
lines also meander through the mountains to eventually connect to Russia via Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. Taking out this bridge was not only interesting because it is one of the farthest north targets struck during the entire war, but it's also a very public message to China, who has been long suspected of shipping the Iranians materiel and supplies to carry on the fight. In the Strait of Hormuz, civilian merchant traffic continued to transit the waterway, but since last night the traffic has slowed to a halt again with very few crossings throughout the day. As a reminder, it takes up to 2 months for a tanker to make its way to the U.S. from the Middle East. Consequently, if the Iranians shut down the strait again due to this targeting, or if companies simply decide that the risk isn't worth it, the world would only have the benefit of a handful of tankers which have been able to make the crossing over the past couple of weeks. This does not even remotely come close to alleviating the problems that prompted the MOU being signed. President Trump himself said that, at the time, the U.S. only had about 4 weeks' worth of strategic
And it takes longer than 4 weeks for one of these tankers to reach the United States to begin with.
reserve left before shortages began. As the fighting has resumed to some degree, the status of the global energy crisis remains a very real concern, and the clock starts ticking down as the flow of petroleum slows down once again. This concludes The Wire for 2300 Zulu, July 9th, 2026.
Okay, that's a nice little summary to add at the end. We're still heading for an oil shortage this summer, and I'm still saying that around August is where the oil shock will be in full force, and the United States will finally be serious about negotiations, and we might start to see some type of real agreement. Anyway, this will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kiko or Twitch, and I'll see you next video. Bye.